Buhari's government appeals against Saraki's acquittal. The federal government has appealed against the acquittal of Senate President Bukola Saraki. The government described the tribunal's decision as unconstitutional and without jurisdiction. Saraki was acquitted and discharged of charges of corruption and false declaration of assets. President Muhammadu Buhari's government has filed notice of appeal against the acquittal of Senate President Bukola Saraki. NAJ.com earlier reported that the Code of Conduct Tribunal dismissed the case of false asset declaration against Nigeria's Senate President, Bukola Saraki today June 14. Nigeria's Senate President, Bukola Saraki. Reports have it that the notice of appeal was signed by the lead prosecuting counsel, Rotimi Jacobs, SAN, and an assistant chief state counsel in the Federal Ministry of Justice, Pius Akita. It said, by the provisions of paragraphs 11, 2, 3, and 13, of Part 1, 5th Schedule to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, as amended, once the Code of Conduct form filled by the public officer is investigated and found to be false, or that some assets are beyond the legitimate income of the public officer, or that the assets were acquired by means of corrupt practices, the public officer concerned is deemed to have breached the Code of Conduct, and it is for him to show to the tribunal that there is no infraction in the form. The Honorable Tribunal wrongly placed the onus of proof on the prosecution contrary to paragraphs 11, 2, 3, and 13, of Part 1, 5th Schedule to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, as amended. The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, as amended, clearly excluded the presumption of innocence on the allegation of infraction of the Code of Conduct by public officers, and the tribunal wrongly applied the presumption of innocence contrary to the constitutional requirement. Government sought two prayers, which include an order setting aside the ruling of the Code of Conduct Tribunal delivered on June 14, 2017, upholding the no-case submission raised by the respondent, Saraki, at the close of the prosecution's case, and an order calling upon the respondent to enter his defense. The appellant stated that the CCT failed to analyze and evaluate the evidence of prosecution witnesses. The notice of appeal also added, the learned members of the tribunal, in their consideration of no-case submission, failed in their duty to look at the offenses charged, the ingredients of the offense, and the evidence adduced by the prosecution before upholding the respondent's no-case submission. The learned members of the tribunal failed to analyze and evaluate the evidence of prosecution witnesses before reaching their conclusion that there is no case made out against the respondent. The tribunal failed in its duty to point out the material evidence adduced by the prosecution witnesses touching the ingredients of the offense charged that was discredited by the respondent's counsel during cross-examination. The learned members of the tribunal failed to consider and apply the decision of the Supreme Court Ndoba v. State, 1977, 5 SC 197 at 315. Where the Supreme Court held that if the submission is based on discredited evidence, such discredited evidence must be apparent on the face of the record, and that if such is not apparent, then the submission is bound to fail. The learned members of the tribunal failed to point out any apparent discredited evidence on the face of the record before it upheld the submission of a no case. The tribunal failed in its duty to point out the essential ingredients of the offenses charged and the evidence adduced by the prosecution to show that the available evidence could not establish the ingredients of the offenses. the tribunal failed to apply the provisions of Sections 302 and 303 of the Administration of Criminal Justice Act, 2015 in upholding the no-case submission made by the respondent. NAJ.com recalls that the victory of Senate President Bukola Saraki at the Code of Conduct Tribunal, CCT, had opened a can of worms. At the center of it all is Amoy El Sawar, publisher of online newspaper, Sahara Reporters and chairman of PACAC, Professor Tsege.